Nothing I can say that folks don't criticize me, but I'm gonna do just as I want to anyway, and don't care if they all despise me. If I should take a notion to jump into the ocean, ain't nobody's business if I do. Rather than persecute me, I choose that you would choose me. Ain't nobody's business if I do or if I do. If I go to church on Sunday, then cabaret on Monday, ain't nobody's business if I do. If I let my best companion drive me right in the canyon, ain't nobody's business if I do or if I do. After all, a way to do is do just as you please, regardless of their talking. Oftentimes the ones that talk will get down on their knees and beg your pardon for their walking. If I dislike my lover and leave him for another, ain't nobody's business if I do. If I go turtle shoving with one another's loving, ain't nobody's business if I do or if I do. It Mr. Down, 'cause it ain't nobody's business if you do. If my friend ain't got no money, then I say, take all mine, honey. Ain't nobody's business if I do, not if I do. Positively, Mr. Gallagher. Absolutely, Mr. Shim. Absolutely, Mr. Sheriff.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the opening night of the 39th Giornata del Cinema Muto Pordenone Silent Film Festival. Thanks so much for joining. I'm dressed for opening night. Let me lower this a little bit. Before we start, what I want to call attention to, which I didn't do earlier, is the wonderful, extraordinary festival trailer that Richard Williams so beautifully did for us a number of years ago, which is very close to the heart of everyone who has attended the festival, anyone who will see it now. Dan van den Horck has generously recorded 11 different accompaniments to each time that the trailer is being screened. So we're thrilled that this is our symbol, our identity. And we're equally thrilled that Dan was able to record such lovely little pieces for each one. Before we start the discussion, we're going to have a brief introduction from the Library of Congress. So stay tuned for that, and then the conversation afterwards.
Hello, my name is Heather Linville, and I'm the Motion Picture Laboratory Supervisor at the Library of Congress National Audiovisual Conservation Center. I'm pleased to be here as part of this special edition of the Pordenone Silent Film Festival. Over the last couple months, the National Audiovisual Conservation Center has been part of the library's phased reopening plans. The goal of the phased reopening is to resume audio, video, and film digitization and preservation workflows. I'm happy to report that digitization workflows have resumed in the film lab, and plans are in place to restart photochemical preservation operations towards the end of this year. I would like to take this opportunity to take you on a virtual tour of the film lab to show you the type of work that we do and to show you how films like Penrod and Sam make it from the film vaults to a theater or living room near you. Once a film in the vaults is determined to be a source for either digital or photochemical preservation, the first stop for that element, once it arrives in the film lab, is film inspection and repair. Film is inspected and uniquely prepared for each workflow based on the type of equipment the film will run through, whether it be for digitization or photochemical preservation. Each staff person preparing film for preservation has hands-on experience operating the printers and scanners used in the lab. Therefore, they know what repair or film preparation is needed based on their assessment of the condition of the source element. This ensures the prepped reel runs smoothly in order to achieve the highest quality preservation of that element. Once prepped, the film makes its way to one of our 2 ultrasonic cleaning machines to remove any additional dirt and debris on the surface of the film. If the source element is being preserved photochemically, it moves to one of our 4 printers to be used to create a new preservation master element, or access copy, like a new 35mm print. Here we see a source element being threaded onto one of our printers. This is the lab's BHP Wetgate printer. Wetgate printing enables surface scratches on a preservation source element to be temporarily hidden at the time of exposure onto a new element. This is done by immersing the source frame in a liquid that hides the scratch. As a result, the defect is not printed or exposed onto the new film element. Along with the exposures determined by the lab's chief timer, printing begins, creating a new properly exposed film element with minimal defects built in from the source element by way of Wetgate printing. This newly exposed film stock moves to the processing stage, where it is developed on one of the lab's 2 processors. One processor is used to create new 35mm black and white prints. The other, processor number 2, as we see here, develops new 35mm black and white preservation master elements. The exposed but unprocessed stock goes to the dark side of the processor and is threaded on the machine, beginning its travel through the various processing baths. At the end of the trip, the newly developed preservation master reel takes up on the other end. This reel will be evaluated by the chief timer to ensure the exposure and printing steps yielded the expected results. If a source element is prepped for digitization, the reel moves to one of our 3 film scanners. At the film preparation stage, scanning resolution is confirmed based on the assessment of the film element. In most cases, original camera negative elements, as well as masters and prints made from those camera negatives, are scanned at 4K resolution. These archival master files in a DPX format are converted to JPEG 2000 for long-term storage in our digital archive. Digital workflows can vary on a title-by-title basis based on the end deliverable needed. For theatrical presentation, restoration techniques always include color correction or tint recreation using one of the lab's 3 Resolve grading suites. More complex restorations can also include editorial assembly from multiple sources, image stabilization, and deflicker, to name a few. While this expanded digital restoration workflow is new, the lab continues to improve upon its in-house capabilities to create new restored versions of films from the library's collections. I hope you all enjoyed the tour of the National Audiovisual Conservation Center Motion Picture Laboratory. I'd like to thank Jay Weisberg and everyone at the festival for inviting me to speak with you today. And now I bid you happy viewing.
Thank you very much, Heather. Thank you, Library of Congress, for bringing us such a fantastic film. So now we're going to have a discussion. Remember that there is the possibility for the audience to ask questions in chat that we will then field to our guests. So I'm very happy to be able to introduce to you first Stephen Horn, the wonderful musician who accompanied the film. He's with us from London.
Hello.
Hello, Stephen. Then Catherine Fusco, Associate Professor of English at the University of Nevada in Reno.
Hello.
Hello, Catherine. And David Pierce from the Library of Congress.
Welcome, Jay.
Thank you very much. David, you're in Culpeper now or in Washington?
No, I'm in Culpeper. The library is based in Washington, but the film, television, and recorded sound archive is in Culpeper.
Great. Okay, thank you so much for being with us. I'd like to first actually start with you, David, if you could talk a little bit about William Bodine, because we have this unfair assessment of him, I think, because he made so many films later on in his career, so many, I have to say, really awful films. Some things like Jesse James Meets Frankenstein's Daughter, I think, is something that will haunt me forever as a child, because I just remember how awful it was. And yet then you see something like Penrod and Sam, you see something like The Canadian, you see something like Sparrows with Mary Pickford. There's an inventiveness, an understanding of visual style that seems to have been forgotten.
Yes, well, William Bodine's career took a bad turn in the 1930s, but he started out, as many others, in working for D.W. Griffith as an assistant director, and then moved into directing two real comedies, and then was able to take his comedic skills into making features for Warner Brothers. And this movie was released by First National, a different company. He was out on loan from Warner Brothers, and it was his ability to get these performances out of the child actors in Penrod and Sam, and in films both before and after this one, which unfortunately don't survive, which led to his being hired by Mary Pickford to do two films. First, Little Annie Rooney, which is a child film, kids film with 30-ish Mary Pickford playing one of the kids, and then Sparrows, and he gets wonderful performances out of the kids in those. And then he went on to work at Paramount, and his last film for Paramount was in 1934, The Old-Fashioned Way, with W.C. Fields. And then he said that he made a fatal career decision. He got an offer to direct a film in England and thought that would be a good vacation for he and his family. And then he spent 3, 4, 5 years in England, ended up making some films with Will Hay, and then, which are quite delightful. And then when he came back to the US, nobody remembered him, nobody wanted to hire him. And that does sound kind of fishy, but if you read Peter Bogdanovich's interview with Alan Dwan, Dwan made a picture in the UK in the early 30s and had the same problem when he returned, in that nobody wanted to hire someone who hadn't made a picture in a year. So Bodine took whatever jobs he could get and made a lot of films, made them quickly. He wasn't, it was really kind of the same style of filmmaking that applied for television. And he moved into television in the 1950s and directed many series, including many episodes of the Lassie television show. But the thing that I look for is not, what kind of films are you making, but how long was your career? And this is someone whose career started in 1909 and continued into the 1960s. So I think that he had a successful career, but he obviously worked in many different levels in the industry, starting off on the top and ending up, with many years at Monogram and other independents, production companies, and then finally picking up work where he could get it.
Mm. Catherine, you've been doing quite a bit of work recently on the Our Gang comedies, and also the workings of children and race as well in American film. And I wonder what your reactions were when you first saw Penrod and Sam, how you saw that fitting into and then differing from the Our Gang films and others of that period.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's I saw in the notes introducing this film a note saying that this film avoids a lot of the racial stereotypes we might expect of a film of this kind, and I think that's true to a certain extent. So I don't know if other people react the same way, but there's a moment where Penrod is getting ready to blow coal dust right onto Roddy Jr., and it feels very much like a setup for a blackface gag, and then we don't actually get the blackface gag, which is something of a relief. And also, I think this film shares with films like the Our Gang films this kind of integrationist feeling, where the black children and the white children and a Jewish child are playing together, in this lot, and it's this kind of utopian space. I do think there are some interesting differences in the way that the black children are treated in this film as opposed to the white children. So on the one hand, I do think we've got that integrationist impulse with the children, although like in the Our Gang films, there is very little of a black adult world on screen, and that's kind of interesting. Whereas we have so much of a white adult world that we see. But also in the performances, I think you can see that there's a difference in the acting style that's being drawn out of the white child actors as opposed to what's being drawn out of the black child actors. So I think the acting that we see the white children being directed to do is much more naturalistic, where we do see some of that kind of mugging from the black child actors. And they're also the comedy that they're involved in is a lot broader. So there's a lot of jokes, I think, that tie the Black children to animals particularly, whereas sometimes the comedy with the white children is a little more subtle. But one thing that's kind of interesting about this film compared to the Our Gang films is the presence of a kind of romantic possibility for the Black children, right? There's that little flirtation with the girl sweeping the porch, and then there's obviously the parallel romance for Penrod, and that's something that's pretty absent in the Our Gang comedies, and so it's kind of nice to see that here. It's nice to see that Black girls exist in this world, whereas they're relatively absent in the Our Gang world. So I thought it was a pretty interesting film. It kind of cuts progressive in some ways and is a little bit regressive in other ways. I was also just interested to see that the Black children are playing rebel soldiers in the Civil War game that opened the film. So.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it's so interesting to see how the screenwriters, Louis Light and Hope Loring, really changed the novel. The novel is considerably more what we would think of as outright racist. All the Black characters speak in a kind of patter that is almost impossible to understand. That becomes part of a joke. As what you were saying before, about Black adult characters, they're almost non-existent in the novel as well. So for me, it's just fascinating to see how the screenwriters were changing so much of what Booth Tarkington had written, and made them feel more integrated with, as you were saying, the exaggerations. I mean, what you said about the soot being blown, exactly. I was thinking, oh God, we're going to have a blackface moment, and he avoids that. And for me, that's such a surprise and a pleasure, because, or the sort of really bug-eyed looks that you get so often with African American children in this period. That Bodine, for the most part, avoids that.
And also, when you've got the Black child up in the closet, you're just expecting with that gown that drops on him for it to be that you've seen many, many times, and they don't do it.
Yeah, there's stereotypes that are avoided, and it's sort of interesting to see the choices that don't get made. I think here that there's a kind of easier comedy that isn't gone for, and I think that's kind of true of the way the children are treated in general. I think for the most part, this is a film that takes children seriously, which is kind of wonderful. I find that moving.
And what's also nice is that the parents, the Schofield parents in particular, they have a sense of humor. Mm-hmm. They're not stick figures that, Gladys Brockwell's Mrs. Schofield, she's giggling at times. She knows how ridiculous her son is being, and she knows she has to, in a sense, scold him, but she's laughing at the same time. And it's a wonderful play that you don't get in the Sound 1931 version at all. I think the actors are much better in the 23 version than they are in the 31. But yes, that they're real as well as the children are real.
Yeah, I actually was curious about that in terms of the scoring. I had a question for Stephen just about how he chose to score the kind of adult scenes and the children's scenes, because one of the things I liked about this movie so much is that there's a lot of interaction between adult worlds and children's worlds. It's not like it's a kind of adultless kids film, and it's also not a film that's mostly adults with one precocious orphan or something like that, but they're really interacting. And so I was curious about the musical choices as we kind of move through these interactions between kids world and adult world in the film.
Good question. I don't think I was consciously trying to bring out the differences in the world. I was more marking the emotional and comic development, other than showing some of there was some comedy at the expense of adults when their pomposity was punctured. But there wasn't a particularly I didn't really plan something on that level particularly.
But Stephen, there was one thing that pleased me enormously when I was listening, and when the two boys, when Penrod and Sam are being scolded for the initiation of Georgie Bassett, yeah. There's not only the dialogue between the parents and the children, but you increase that with the dialogue of music, and I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. Yes,
well, you sort of that's a question of looking at the the speech patterns on screen and the rapidity with which the mouth is moving, mixed with their physical actions combined with the intertitles. It's all kind of there on the screen, that as things get more nervous, they're talking faster. And so it's a sort of kind of an abstraction of Mickey Mousing, I guess. It's like trying to find a musical equivalent of what you might be hearing in the room, in the dialogue that's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not exactly Mickey Mousing. It's an equivalent of both what's been said and also what's been felt, abstracted in musical terms.
Also, one of the things I find interesting is just how much as the novel does. The novel, when you read it, it's not really a children's novel at all. He uses a vocabulary, Tarkington uses a vocabulary that no child is going to really know. Even adults now are not going to know a lot of it. And I don't mean the slang, I just mean proper English. And the film itself somehow manages, I think, to work on both levels, as a children's film and as an adult film. I don't know if you'd like to comment on that. Catherine? Or David or Catherine.
Well, you go ahead.
I think that they knew that they had to reach all of the audiences, that a lot of the people who made the choice of what films to see at the time, 1922, were the women of the household. So they needed to have some strong female roles in there and not just all about kids. And that, Tarkington was at the time considered one of America's great novelists, like Sinclair Lewis, and to adapt his stories was significant. After the release of this film, the producer J.K. McDonald produced some two-reelers with about Penrod, but apparently they didn't have much market impact because they weren't directed by William Bodine or by someone of similar caliber.
Right. No, I hadn't known that. The novel itself is quite piecemeal. It's one episode after another. They don't always connect. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And we've had a question about that, that it seems that at one point the storyline is going to develop between Penrod's sister and her boyfriend, played by Gareth Hughes, and then it doesn't really seem to go anywhere. And I think this is partly the novel, because that is in the novel. Indeed, it doesn't really go anywhere. It becomes a gag. But I do think that Leighton and Loring really do a remarkable job of bringing it together in a better way than Tarkington always does. It flows better. For anybody who's interested, by the way, do check out on the Women Film Pioneers Project website, the extraordinary website. Annie Burke has written a very, very interesting article about Hope Loring, following her career. And they also wrote films, It with Clara Bow. They wrote Wings, the William Wellman film. So I think that's really interesting. And I was also wondering, there are visual clues that sometimes it's not always easy to know. And I'm interested, David, what you might think about this, whether that was in the script or whether that was something that Bodine did. So, for example, in the shack, there's that wonderful mirror that flips up. Yes. So they can see outside. That's certainly not in the novel. Do you think that was something in the script, or that was a Bodine touch?
At this distance, it's hard to tell, but certainly a director would recognize that he had to make things as visual as possible, that you don't want to have a film that's just all titles, particularly with some of the near dialect titles that, kids' titles that they're having here. I think the thing that is more confusing is that 100 years ago, the Eternal Societies were a big part of life. Many people were members of the Elks or other things like that, and that is largely forgotten today. So some of those gags about the initiation, I can't tell you, that's a large secret, really go over the heads of a lot of modern audiences.
Catherine, I'm sure you could comment also on the amount of the Our Gang shorts that also feature these clubhouses.
Yeah, I mean the one that I was thinking about partly because I was watching this sort of thinking about how it was dealing with race is the Lodge Night Our Gang film, which is similar to the use of Berman and Herman here. It kind of has a joke where instead of them being part of the Confederate Army, they're part of a Klan ritual in that film, which is, I think it calls the Klan the Cluck Cluck Clams, if I remember incorrectly. And I do, it's interesting in terms of kind of the utopian sort of integrationist impulse here, because this is also the time of the second Klan in the US. So that's a different kind of fraternal order of sorts, is the second KKK in the US. But I do, I think to the point about how this film stitches together episodes to make something coherent. And I think that, the Mary Philbin plot is a little bit of a hanging thread, but it does really come full circle in some ways, right? There's the opening war, and it kind of ends with the child saying that he's going to go get his gang and bring it back. And I do think that there is a kind of coherence in terms of the way it is involved in looking at these different adult rituals, kind of making fun of them, but they're so violent in many ways, right? There's a lot of damage that's coming from the adult world to the child world, right? There's adult hierarchies, and there's the money hierarchy, and, a kind of insistence on punishment from the adult world that leads to, and I would actually be curious to throw this to Stephen again, leads to this very violent middle section of the film, right? Where the children are made to do this initiation, sort of bringing the other boy in. Then there's the demand for punishment, and then there's the punishment that turns out to be much more violent. And there's a kind of bizarre teaching moment where Roderick Sr. is watching the beating with Roderick Jr. And then it turns out there's a nail, and then we get the horrible sequence with the dog being hit by the car. And so there's a lot of violence from the adult world, such that by the end of the film, when there's going to be a gang war, and I actually feel much worse about it than at the opening, right? Because we've seen that there's this kind of violence in this world for the kids. But anyway, I guess to maybe think a little bit about a bit more about the music, I'd be curious to think about approaching that film, because I was very surprised by the dog's death personally when I watched the film, and I was just curious about preparing that musical sequence.
Yeah, I mean, what I always try to do is play the film in the spirit that I think it was, with which it was made, rather than my 2020 reaction to the film. So my feeling was, I think if anything about the film feels a bit politically incorrect now, it's sort of aspects of bullying and corporal punishment and things like that, rather than perhaps, the racial stereotyping. But my reading of the film was that those elements weren't, that the film didn't feel that those were controversial, that they were played quite for, strictly for laughs, really. And I feel that the moment with the dog is meant to be a kind of sucker punch, that you don't see coming right in the middle of the film. I don't think we're meant to feel that the increasing violence, which is there, is building up to this moment. I think that's meant to come out of nowhere. So, on the basis of trying to play the film in the spirit that it was made in, I perhaps played those early violent scenes, more for comedy, so that the moment with the dog is really out of the blue.
It is. I mean, it's very shocking.
Yeah.
But it humanizes Penrod and the girl so much, and it creates the connection between, which has been largely been missing, between Penrod and his father and Penrod and his mother. And I think it would be a much more just kind of superficial film if we didn't have that humanizing bit in the middle. And it also shows with the rich man that even though he ran over the dog with his car, he feels absolutely no emotion as far as taking the graveside away or anything regarding to Penrod. It's just a thing to him.
Absolutely. And what I also find interesting is that entire sequence, that plot line doesn't appear in the book at all, in any of the three Penrod books that Tarkington wrote. But although the 1931 version is a different screenwriter, they've kept that. So clearly it was realized exactly, I think, David, what you're saying is it makes Penrod, it humanizes him more. It makes him a much more sympathetic character, certainly more sympathetic than he is in the book, I find. And it allows the development of the relationship between his parents that I think it just works so well.
Yeah. Can I pick up quickly on the Mary Filden subplot? I think, first of all, it provides some nice parallelism between what romance means at different ages of your life within that family. But the films were later remade with Doris Day and Gordon MacRae as By the Light of the Silvery Moon and On Moonlight Bay in the early 1950s by Warner Brothers, who obviously never missed a chance to reuse an asset. And the leads are those two teenage characters. And Penrod basically shows up in a couple of scenes. So it's quite disorienting to watch if you've seen Penrod and Sam, because they've taken the same raw materials and completely subverted it to focus on the teenage romance.
Wow, no, I didn't realize that. Very interesting. Somebody is asked in the... Pardon? Oh, sorry, I thought there was it must have been a feedback. Somebody's asked if we know where the film was shot, and I'm not, that's not something that I know about. David, might you know where it might have been shot?
I wasn't able to find anything. Certainly, Bodine was based on the West Coast at the time, so it could have been in any one of the small towns that encompassed Los Angeles County at the time. I think we need John Bengston for this.
Yeah, definitely. And also, Kevin Brownlow's written the catalog note, which you can find online. He talks about the success of the film, and it was indeed a great success, which clearly was remembered later on when it was remade 2 more times in the sound era.
And the film was made because the previous year, First National had released Penrod, which was directed by Marshall Nealon. So this was, often follow-ups are less than the original, but this one was just as successful as the original. And to match a Marshall Nealon film when he was one of the top directors in Hollywood was pretty impressive.
And does the Marshall Nealon film survive, David?
No.
Okay.
No. This survives because it was given to the Library of Congress in the early 1970s by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, who had acquired it at some point in the distant past. And unfortunately, their files are closed at the moment, along with a lot of other things in Los Angeles. So I wasn't able to find out exactly how they acquired it, but it's a beautiful nitrate print. And, it just looks glorious on the screen as well as on video.
It looks amazing, actually. I was just delighted to see it, even more now than the first time that I saw it. Apropos of the restoration, I was wondering if you could say why this film was chosen. Why did you decide, okay, this is a film that we're going to preserve now?
Because it fell into the public domain, finally. You might, in Europe, may not realize this, but the United States copyright term is a fixed year term of 95 years for films of this era. So the copyright was renewed by Warner Brothers, and we had this print that didn't come from Warner Brothers, but we couldn't do anything with it until the copyright finally expired. And then we were able to get it out and show it without having to, run everything through the studio. So that's actually the reason that it came off the shelf, is we're looking at all the films from 1922 in the collection that would now be in the public domain. And we're doing it now for the films from 1925 that are about to fall in the public domain.
That's great to hear. That's very, very good. I'm looking at some of the comments, and the dog cameo, of course, gets quite a lot of attention, as he should, or she should, I think, because the dog is amazing. Steve Matt has written cameo rules, and yes, I think that's agreed. Somebody else has written that they had to send a warning to a friend, a dog-loving friend, in case they were very concerned it might be too emotionally difficult. The dog is just also a highlight, I think, of the movie. We also have Melanie Self has said that she's thinking also of parallels with some of the early Ozu films and how Ozu handles children as well. I wonder, Catherine, if you if you sense that as well, or do you think that there's just too much chalk and cheese? Or
I don't know that I can speak to that, Melanie, but thanks for that question. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it is, I want to say that this film, I think does do a lot of really wonderful work with the child actors, but there are still those moments. I wrote down one line this time. There's the like, gee, Mr. Bitts, didn't you ever have a little dog kind of moment, which is very, heartstring pulling. But, there's also, I think, stuff that's a lot less, I don't know, cheap, I guess, in its emotional appeals. Like the scene with the father near the end, where I think you can see the kind of work that you might see with Pickford later, or that you see with Griffith, where there's a lot of little bits of business that do a lot of work, with Penrod taking his tie off and the father removing his shoes for him. And I think that's lovely, and it's a lot less of the just kind of weeping child close up kind of stuff. So.
And David, apropos of comedy, I was thinking there's a wonderful scene as well when they're early on in the film, when there's suddenly two dogs. There's the ceramic dog, and then there's two. And this too, of course, clearly doesn't exist in the novel. Surely this is also coming out of Bodine's earlier work in comedies in the teens, don't you think?
Oh, yes. And when we ran this live at Mostly Lost a year and a half ago, that got one of the biggest laughs. But it's much easier to train a dog to do something, including that wonderful prayer scene, than it is to train kids or get a performance out of kids. So I was glad that it wasn't just kind of a lot of mechanical gags, that most of the gags are coming out of the performances and the emotion.
And Stephen, I wonder if you could also address that when you were watching it for the first time. Were you also thinking of changes in rhythmic style between, let's say, comedy from the teens and we're already here in 23? Were you thinking of parallels between the two, or you saw this as something that was quite different?
Well, when I started the film, I came into it expecting sort of classic Americana, and although that was there and came certainly later, the first part of the film did seem to play quite like a comedy short, like a prototype Our Gang comedy. So I kind of wanted to, with the very opening credits, I wanted to sort of kick off with a slightly sort of slapstick theme that tells the audience, basically you're going to have fun with this. But then when the first proper intertitle about the joys and sadness of childhood comes up, I had a slightly more, it was a theme that was still upbeat, but with a kind of slightly modal quality, which I could then sort of play variations on later in the film as the film gets a bit sort of darker. And I also wanted the theme to have a sort of slightly rushing, out of control quality to it, like sort of almost tripping over its feet. That feeling you get in childhood where, everything's moving too fast for you. So that was kind of, I wanted to create this feeling that it was fun, but ever so slightly out of control, and that at some point it would be caught, it would come to an abrupt halt. And then obviously the fun comes back later on.
And I think you caught that beautifully. You raised a point about Americana. Catherine, I wonder if you could also talk about how you see this fitting into concepts of Americana at that time. Sinclair Lewis, in fact, was a writer also that David Pierce mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is interesting because it isn't just, it's not pure nostalgia, right? It has, I think, a little bit, I mean, it's not as modernist or dark as something like Winesburg, Ohio, I don't think, or it's not quite as critical as a novel like Babbitt or something like that, those novels, but I do think it has some of that critique, right? So the novel, the Tarkington novel is from 1916, I believe, and this is 1923, and so I think a lot of the Americana is placed onto the children specifically, right? And I think that's part of what's interesting about the way that they're playing with adult rituals, right? And kind of puncturing those adult rituals, right? So they've got the army, right? So the Americana, also the Civil War, which is, there's a kind of nostalgia, this weird nostalgic relationship to the Civil War in the era. So that's all kind of placed onto the children who are in this kind of free zone, which is threatened, by money, right? By adult money, the purchase of this lot. I think it's interesting that the lot is being purchased not to build anything on, right? It's just sort of a speculation that pays off. So I do think there is this edge that's a little more sophisticated in this look at small town life, right? There's a sense that the kind of childish innocence that is good-natured, essentially, right, and noble, essentially, in the way that the film presents it, it is a little bit under threat, right? Like there's some adult interference going on with that. So it's, I think it is cut a little bit by the presence of this kind of adult world. So it's not just everything is kind of solved with schoolyard fisticuffs, right?
That idea of nostalgia, I think, is so important. Also, the very opening titles, which is talking about trying to make us go back into our own boyhoods. So it's the question of not only nostalgia for our childhoods, but indeed nostalgia for a mythical Americana, middle America place where, you walk down the street and everybody there, you play together, all of that sort of thing, even if is the goody boy and there's the bully and all of that. But at the same time, there's something quite mythical about it.
Yeah, and even, the film is able to imagine, I'd mentioned that the Black children are made part of the rebel army. They're also in that pageant of 1776, right? They're there too. So there is this real fantastical imagining of the past by the film, right? That's very utopian in its look backwards, right?
Yeah, in fact, I'm seeing a question here. Why was the rich boy excluded? He was part of the gang in the beginning. Is there any lesson to be learned from that?
Well, I noticed that when the rich boy's father buys the lot, that's the only way he can express love, is by excluding, the other kids, by buying something for his kid, so his kid can then exclude other kids. And that so many of the things that the kids are doing, on that lot with the their lodge and the initiation and the circus are echoes of what grown-ups do. And Our Gang shorts often built, whole gag sequences around that. But here it doesn't seem to be done quite as overtly or literally for gags, but more of, the kids wanting both to enjoy their childhood and grow up as rapidly as possible.
Yeah. It's interesting that father also can't remember his childhood, right? He's sort of contrasted with Penrod's father, right? Yeah. So Penrod has that appeal, right? Don't you ever remember your little dog? And he doesn't. Yeah. And then the father clearly does, like he looks out the window and sees how Penrod plays with the lot and clearly does remember his boyhood. So there's this kind of difference, this parallel difference between the fathers and sons there.
Yeah. But as charming as the film is, I'm just cringing when the father, husband, sells the lot without mentioning it to his wife until after the fact, and then takes the family savings to buy it back without mentioning it to his wife until after the fact. And it's clear that dynamic was what was in place at the time. And the wife's job, well, there was actually a cook in the house. So what was the wife's job? What was her role?
Just as what's Mrs. Schofield's role too, you can say. I mean, they have the African American maid, and actually, which is interesting because in the novel she's Irish rather than African American. With all of the expected Irish stereotypes in terms of how she speaks as well with her friend. But yes. Sorry, I'm just looking at one of the comments now about, talking about how dark it can be and the concept of schoolyard order, I think, which is also, and the parallels, which is what you're saying, both of you, about parallels between childhood and adulthood. Somebody has also asked if, this is an aside, if the ceramic dog was an early example of product placement, as in his master voice. I don't think so. In 1923, it would have been already kind of late, I think, for an early product placement. Don't you agree?
I think that it was, since it didn't say Victor anywhere, I think it was just a gag that some of the audience would get, and others it might just go over their head.
Yeah, no, I think you're probably right, but it is a really good gag. Sorry, I'm just looking to see other questions here, or if anybody here has something that we haven't broached so far that you'd like to delve into.
Well, I'd just like to mention that this seems to have been one of a flood of films that followed Chaplin's The Kid and the surprise stardom of Jackie Coogan. And there were certainly many, many children's films. Jackie Coogan, making films for Saul Lesser, and also with his father as producer. And then, as we know, Baby Peggy in shorts and features. And this would have fit right in. But so many of those others didn't go for the emotional angle. They went more for the gags angle. So I think that this film took some chances and that it was largely successful. But you could have had no trouble walking down the street in a big city and finding a theater that was showing a movie with a kid star.
I agree with that. Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I really agree with that. I've been reading lots of fan magazines lately, and there's a lot of complaints about the kind of number of children's movies, right? And complaints about Jackie Coogan and, when he's getting too old and, all that kind of thing. And, complaints about the sophistication of the American moviegoers' viewing palette from certain people writing letters. And I think this film avoids some of what people would have been complaining about when they felt that, too much children's fare might be showing up.
Yeah,
so.
And it was still fairly early in the cycle.
Yeah.
It's a shame, from what I understand. I mean, Bodine had made films with Wesley Barry before, at least 3, I think, before Penrod and Sam. So Barry at that point, I think, was a little bit older than the children in Penrod and Sam, but still they were considered children's films, and I don't think that any of them survived. So it would be interesting to sort of go back at least to see what the reception of those were, how they were working with both the idea of childhood and also the idea of Americana.
Right,
but that's,
and Wesley Barry had played Penrod in the Marshall Nealon film the year before.
Yeah, no, exactly. So I think that's really interesting. And also that it seems that the children are coded as younger in this 1923 version, because Barry, I think, would have been older again in 22, and in the 1931 version, the children are older. So I don't, and why that might be, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, that might actually, Catherine, I don't know if you've given that some thought of where's the sort of cutoff with boys on film.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought about that specifically. So if folks don't know, someone asked a question about Berman's name. I mean, there's a lot of gag naming of Black children in particular, especially in our gang. And so Buckwheat, Farina, all the kind of serial named children. But Herman goes on to be Pineapple. That the young actor who's playing Herman here goes on to be Pineapple. And I think the aging out is really interesting, especially with Black child stars who were very beloved. So Alan Hoskins, who plays Farina in our gang, who's little brother to Pineapple, was just, I mean, the intense emotional attachment that people had to the character Farina, it was overwhelming. And people were really sad when he aged out, which I if I recall correctly, it was around 12. So like as puberty is coming, right, as puberty is beckoning, there's, I mean, Shirley Temple kind of went through a similar thing. People were kind of concerned about her becoming less cute. The onset of adolescence where I think some of the play at adulthood no longer looks charming, right? Because it actually is proximate, right? So you can't satirize adulthood in quite the same way, or the play towards sexuality and adult themes no longer can feel as innocent or as safe, perhaps. I think that's there, but obviously dependent on the appearance of the child, right? So there were a lot of complaints about like Jackie Coogan being too old to wear bangs in some of the magazines. There's I think some of it is just a reaction to like gangliness that comes on at a certain point.
And Mary Pickford too old to wear curls at a certain point too. I think I imagine all of us at the moment are missing the fact that it would have been marvelous if Baby Peggy could have joined us. Diana Sarah Carey, who wrote so movingly about not only her experience as a child star, but also about other Hollywood actors, Jackie Coogan included. Her passing this year was just another nail in the horror of 2020. And of course, even several years ago, at this point, I think it's just over 4 years, Jean Darling, who was in a number of the Our Gang films and also spoke so movingly, but also intelligently about what that whole experience was, being a child star and then being aged out of that. It would be interesting to think more about the differences between boys and girls and how the public perception was regarding both, or how the studios perceived it, even more perhaps than how the public. I think we're just nearing up the 1 hour mark, and so I think we should probably end, unless I'm looking for any other questions here or any other things that somebody else would like to comment on. No? Okay. Stephen, we're going to just say again, thank you so much. And we'll be also seeing you on Tuesday.
Yeah.
No, on Friday. I'm sorry, on Friday for a discussion also with other musicians about the use of multiple instruments in films. So we're looking forward to that. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, David. It's been great to have you with us. Just another thing before I go, tomorrow, don't forget, the screening at 5 p.m. is The Brilliant Biograph from iFilm Museum, and then at 8:30, the Chinese film Guo Feng. So thank you again to my guests, our guests, and see you tomorrow, I hope, and see you in Pordenone next year.